Justin Dove is a nationally certified school psychologist and licensed educational psychologist. Over 14 years, his professional journey has spanned several Ohio, Georgia, and California schools. Justin earned his BS in human ecology and MA and EdS in school psychology from The Ohio State University. He currently serves Merman School, an independent school devoted to the education of intellectually gifted children. Justin also partners with families, school districts, and other educational entities to provide presentations, evaluations, advocacy, counseling, and empowerment services through his company, EdS. His work centers around mental health, social justice, neurodiversity, affirming practices, and culturally sensitive assessment. Hi, Justin. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
So, my first question, I really wanted to speak to you because you're on the ground inside of school. So, the first thing I wanted to ask you about is academics. So, global PISA scores have been falling since the early 2010s. Between 2018 and 2022, mean performance in mathematics fell by a record 15 points. One hypothesis is that technology is distracting young people inside of class and taking time away from homework and studying outside of class. So, why do you think test scores are dropping so rapidly in recent years?
Yeah, so it's troubling to hear data like that. Certainly because you think about the implications of that data on the long-term outcomes of our kids, particularly if we're talking about mathematics. If we're not comparing to where we were in STEM areas, which are so important, for the economy of tomorrow, then that's a problem. And so I think it certainly can be the assertion that technology has become a distraction. I think that that's probably likely to a great extent. But then when we look at the mental health conditions of kids and just where they are, I think that there are just more things that our kids are dealing with, perhaps. With social media and technology being a piece of it, but not necessarily the only piece. Our kids just have a lot more on their plate that's perhaps taking them and diverging or taking away their attention from the academic studies that perhaps they focused on in the past.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about just the time demand on kids. So, the tech statistics are kids are spending 5 hours a day online just on social media, and it goes all the way up to nine if you factor in all the other screen activities. So, that's the screen portion. One
Yes.
of the things that I've been talking to many of our experts about is also just the demands outside of that with things like elite sports and things that
Yes.
it seems like everything's accelerated, right? In the past 10 years or so, maybe, would you say?
Yes, that's my sense of it. I think childhood of today is definitely a bit different than the childhood that I experienced, and certainly from generations prior to me. And I share that not just saying that that's necessarily a problem, because every generation sort of looks at the kids like, okay, you all are not like us. You all don't do the things that we did. But if the outcomes that we're seeing are not necessarily favorable, or if they're not healthy, if they're not productive, then I think that's where we do have to take a critical look at what's different about this generation, perhaps, and how some of these differences may not be serving the children in the way that we would hope that they would.
Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to ask you about focus as well, which is
Yeah.
probably one of the things I hear the most from the school leaders that I work with as a challenge and the teachers. So, our ability to focus just collectively has declined by 69% since 2004. So, back then it was 2.5 minutes, down to
Mhm.
47 seconds now. So, how have kids been, do you think, have been affected by this overall trend and their ability to learn?
Yeah, I think certainly we see less focus or different focus. I don't necessarily want to look at it as less or more, but it's just a different. So
Mhm.
it's a greater need for engagement. It's a greater need for novelty. It's a greater need for multimodality as far as how we're presenting information. Gone are the days where kids are just neatly in rows, sitting quietly with their arms crossed and their legs folded. I mean, that's just not the world that they live in. And so we are in a soundbite society. We are in a instant gratification society, and to some extent, we as educators need to adapt our instructional practices to meet the needs of our kids, but then also being very mindful about the ways that our kids are engaging with technology in ways that may be having a negative impact on things like focus and attention.
Yeah, one of the phrases that I've heard that stuck with me, and I can't remember who said it, is that educators are kind of having to jump through hoops now to compete with some of these
Yes,
high dopamine things that are frankly much more rewarding for the kids' brains,
yes,
right? Like
yes.
it's much more interesting for them to watch a bunch of quick YouTube or TikTok videos or whatever it is to learn on a subject than waiting for that teacher to go through the long form explanation of that same subject, right? So I don't know if you can add to that, but those are a couple things I've heard from teachers.
No, that's consistent with what I've seen in the classroom. And so our teachers just have to get creative and they have to realize that to some extent this generation of kids are going to have the characteristics that we see. We can try, as much as we can to adjust some of the screen time and things of that nature, and we should. But there are going to be some characteristics that are just going to be different about this subset of kids moving forward than perhaps their parents or their grandparents.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things we talk about all the time, and you're right, every generation is different and we
Yes,
always look differently on the next generation, but just how rapidly things have changed, right? Like we've had to
yes.
adjust so quickly compared to any other time in history. And just from my sense, because I talk to so many experts, it just feels like whack-a-mole in so many ways, right? Like we're just constantly trying to adjust and then we adjust and then the needle kind of
Yep.
moves forward. Do you agree with that
I
sentiment?
agree. I agree wholeheartedly. And another thing is, I don't think it's going to slow down. The way technology is just leaping forward. When you think about AI, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I'm not sure where we're headed, but I know it's going to be at a rapid pace. And so we just have to buckle up and do what we can to wrap our arms around these kids and make sure that we're meeting their needs wherever they are.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the pandemic, which I
Yeah.
think, more and more data is coming out. Many parents even are starting to maybe see the effects or understand that there was mental health implications that were part of that.
Yes.
So let's just talk about learning right now and mental health. How did the pandemic affect learning and mental health in kids specifically?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot out there, from the Surgeon General or just from different mental health organizations saying that by and large, the pandemic had some fairly negative effects on the mental health of our children collectively. Now, it's worth noting that there are some populations of kids that thrive during the pandemic. And those were typically neurodivergent kids who weren't necessarily served as well in the traditional school settings. And so they found that freedom, they found that flexibility to be quite liberating. And,
Hmm.
and they found success. So it's worth noting that, there was some success. But again, by and large, there's this sports concept of reps or repetitions. And I think that, when we think about socially from, social interaction, problem solving, emotional regulation, a lot of our kids didn't get the real time reps that they were accustomed to when they were at home or logging in to Zoom spaces. And so we can't necessarily look at the outcomes and the skills that they have on the back end of that experience the same as kids who had those reps in real time situations in person school. And so I think that's one of the primary differences. Like there just wasn't as much opportunity for practice with their peers, with adults facilitating even though we made the best of it, through utilizing technology and Zoom and platforms like that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you zeroed in on kind of the social emotional practice because
Yeah.
we talk a lot about play being the
Yes.
work of children and how they need to do that in order to learn and thrive and everything else. So
Yes.
that obviously had a big impact, right? During that time, kids weren't able to practice those social skills that they needed to do on the playground, right? Because all time was structured and obviously they couldn't be in person. Uh, do you agree with that as well?
Without a doubt, without a doubt. So much of, that SEL is learned in authentic context on the playground, at the lunch table, between, transitions, when the teacher's not necessarily actively teaching something. There is value in sort of the structured SEL programming, but again, the application and a lot of the learning beyond just the lessons happens during those unstructured moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think every age had its challenge. One thing that sticks out, my daughter is going into third grade now. So she started kindergarten right when schools were starting to reopen. And I
Yes.
remember her kindergarten teacher explaining to me because my daughter was lucky enough to be able to go to preschool during COVID.
Yeah. Yes.
But I
Yes.
remember her explaining to me that she was having to teach kids things that they would have learned in preschool, right? So if we just like
Yes.
kind of look at it with those very youngest kids, and then obviously it goes on to up to adolescents who were supposed to be learning how to do the things adolescents do in person, right? Like
Yes.
every age had its challenge. But I remember her specifically telling me, back to teachers having to work harder, that they were teaching social emotional things that should
Yeah.
have been, could have been learned had the kids had the opportunity to do that.
And
So
I've heard similar things from the kindergarten teachers at the school that I serve. Again, we're pushing back sort of, okay, these are the expectations that we've historically had with incoming kindergartners, but there's been a shift because of the experiences that these kindergartners have likely not had that our cohorts of kindergartners have had previously.
yeah. Yeah, it's there's something at every age, I think, that
This is true.
was a challenge. Okay. So my next question again is sort of following up a little bit post-pandemic. So according to a recent study published in JAMA Pediatrics, screen time among children has gone up 52%. That's globally. And that's
Yes.
since the pandemic. So I think the conception is everybody had a lot of screen time during, but it actually accelerated after. So what effect do you think this has had on youth mental health and academic performance? So now we're talking about kind of post pandemic.
Yeah, so I think technology, social media and every aspect of technology is a tool, and that tool can be used for great good, and that tool can also be used, to cause harm, either, inadvertently or sometimes purposely. And so when we think about screen time, one, I think it's important to start with we're never going back to the past where kids were just not on screens. And so we know that screens are a part of our kids' lives. But the question is, what is the quality of their screen time? There's a big difference between spending 2 hours on Duolingo for kids that's really passionate about learning, let's say Italian, versus spending 2 hours on Facebook and looking at the highlight reel of your friends' lives, and using that to make a negative comparison to where you are and what your value is. And so I see that the primary, problem with technology, with social media, with things of that nature is so often our kids are using it in a manner that leads to negative evaluations. That's leading to, well, my life doesn't compare. I didn't get as many likes. I'm not as pretty. And so it is this really fantasy world where everyone is filtered, everyone is giving you that highlight reel, and their brains are not really at a space where they can discern the reality from the fantasy of what they're seeing. And so I think that that's a big issue, and not to mention things like cyberbullying, where a mistake or a picture or video can turn into something that forever changes your life, or seems to at a very young age. And so those are some of the downsides of it. But again, there are some of those pros when used properly and when the proper guide rails are set up.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on something really interesting, which we call, there's a term for this called opportunity cost.
Yeah.
And what that is what you described, which is it's not uh, based on the amount of time they're doing. The question is, what aren't they doing because they're
Yeah.
doing that, right? So
Yes.
I
Yes.
think that's huge. And again, when you look at the numbers, and that's why I phrased it with the increase in time, that's
Yes.
definitely a big part of what we should be looking at, what kids aren't doing, right? So I think that's really important. And then I love that you talked about tech as a tool. That's something that we speak to all the time, and
Hmm.
something that we model for kids. We ask parents to model for kids. So that's really important. And I agree. Like, I almost don't even like the word screen time, because it's, what are you doing on there? Are you doing your
Yep.
math homework, or are you scrolling TikTok? Like, those are two very different things in the context of brain science and mental health. Like, you touched on things like social comparison, right? So you can't compare. Like, we tell parents all the time, we don't even give them screen time recommendations, because
Yeah.
it's really about teaching them what's healthier and less healthy. So I'm so
Yep.
glad you touched on all of those things. Um, okay, so let's circle back to Merman, which is the school that you
Yes.
are serve currently. So Merman works with intellectually gifted kids. So what are the mental health considerations for intellectually gifted kids?
Yeah, so when you look at the research on giftedness and just the information that's out there, there's something that sort of pops out at you, and it's terminology around gifted intensity. And so our kids, have the same emotions, they have the same challenges as many of their, typical peers, if you will. But sometimes the intensity with which they feel those things, the intensity with which they experience those same childhood ups and downs can be much more than perhaps their peers. And so that gifted intensity can be both a strength in some ways. It's the same intensity that can, when it's matched with an area of interest, propel them to learn everything there is to know about that particular topic and cover it from all aspects. But it can also be that intensity that when they experience failure in some area, which inevitably happens, but maybe not as frequently for some of our highly gifted kids as their peers, they may have difficulty processing that. They may see themselves as the failure because I've always been told that I'm smart, and so if I'm having difficulty, that must be incompatible with this very abstract concept of smartness, whatever that means, and we rarely explain it. So we see a lot of perfectionism. We see that intensity, both the positive and negative sides of it. And really, with any difference, any form of neurodivergence, in this case, giftedness, it's going to come with those strengths and weaknesses. So I look at it as differences, and we attempt to leverage those differences to lead to better outcomes, to lead to success, as opposed to pathologizing them to say, okay, this is what's wrong with gifted children and things of that nature. And it's really important to approach it in a very neurodiversity affirming manner.
That's really so interesting. I loved how you kind of simply, to me, what I got is these kids are kind of feeling more maybe than other
Yeah.
kids, right? Like, is that kind of the simplest way of looking at it? Like everything kind of hits them maybe a little bit harder in certain
Yeah,
ways?
they're maybe picking up on more things,
Yeah.
and when they sort of process something or acknowledge something, they're potentially experiencing those emotions in a much deeper way, but don't necessarily have the emotional regulation skills or that maturity yet because they're still, a 9-year-old, even if they're
Yeah.
doing math at a middle school level. So they're still, grappling with that in a very 9-year-old way. But on some level, they might be interpreting the intensity of that emotion with the intellect of someone that is perhaps a bit more advanced. And so there is that asynchronous development, as we call it, where in one area you are maybe 2 or 3, years above whatever is considered typical. But in many ways, you are the same, on the same trajectory as a normal child of your age. And so that can lead to a lot of tension at times.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned perfectionism. Let's talk about
Yeah.
that a little bit more. So perfection in children and teens has increased by 33% over the past 30 years. Some of the
Yeah.
societal factors are some of the things we talked about, but also including competitive college admissions,
Yes.
rising education costs, more controlling parenting styles. We haven't gotten to that yet. We talked
Yes.
about like
Yes.
elite sports, but that's a huge one, and social media comparisons, which we've touched on. So, how do you think the trend toward perfectionism overall, so not just with gifted kids, is affecting youth mental health?
I think it's having a significant and very negative impact on youth mental health. And I think as a society, we really, and as adults, and educators and helping professionals, we really need to encourage all of us to have a more process orientation than an outcome orientation. Because our kids are getting very much tied to the grades and where do I rank and what school am I admitted into and what does that mean about me versus what is the process that I went through to attain whatever this outcome might be. Um, do I have learning behaviors? Can I study? Can I bounce back from adversity? Do I have that resilience? I think there's so much more to be gained in that process than it is about giving a kid a pat on the head because they got first place in the spelling bee or they're number one in their class. I'm sure all of that took hard work. It's not necessarily something that we should avoid acknowledging, but our focus should be on that day to day process of learning, of showing resilience, of bouncing back, of learning more about yourself and showing that self awareness because that's what's going to lead to more successful outcomes across the lifespan than, again, what your grade was in fourth grade science. Not that it doesn't matter, but that shouldn't be the focus.
Yeah. One of the things that came to mind too a little bit when you were talking, we have a term in the digital wellness field, which translates in under other fields as well, called surveillance parenting. I don't know if you've heard of
Yes.
this, where so in the tech world, the context is I can log into my kids' portal and bug them about their homework, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then on like the day to day life, it's I can track where my kid goes. So
Yes.
anywhere, right, through GPS. And this is actually, from my understanding, pretty stressful and anxiety inducing for kids.
Yes.
So it's interesting that you spoke to that on your side, but just in general, there was a statistic, and I'm going to misquote it, but it has something to do with the modern parent. It doesn't matter, what type of parent, what
Hmm.
gender, what role, whatever, spends more time with their kids than like a 50s housewife, right?
Oh,
So it's this
wow.
idea of whether they're working or not working.
Yes.
Parents, I think there's a lot of good in that, right? Parents
Hmm.
being more invested in their kids, but along with that comes a little bit more of this maybe over the top, um, monitoring, right? Which in tech manifests itself in that way. And then in academics, it manifests itself in many of the ways you're talking about. So I
Yes.
don't know if you've heard of that. And then one more thing, like when kids get older, one of the things we've been talking a lot with our younger experts is this idea of being surveilled by your peers. So
Yeah.
nothing you do once you get into that middle and high school and kids start
Yes.
to have phones, everything's recorded, everything, can be basically text can be screenshotted, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
kids are just, I think, very afraid about making the mistakes that they're supposed to make as their kids, right? So I don't know if you want to add to that, but those are the things that came up when you were talking about it.
Yes, and listening to all of that, I think your read of the situation is very accurate. And so then the question becomes, is it a surprise that our kids are dealing with anxiousness and this feeling that I have to be perfect in every context of my life, when every aspect of your life seems to be under some form of monitoring? And if you
Hmm.
make one misstep, you can be canceled or,
Yeah.
publicly just sort of rebuked in ways that are not healthy. And so there was a time where childhood lended itself to a lot of learning, falling down and scraping your knee, getting back up, learning a lesson both literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
Whereas now it seems to be, the stakes seem to be much higher. And I think that, to the term that you use, very anxiety inducing,
Yeah.
which is problematic for our kids.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, last thing too, it doesn't breed a growth mindset, right? Which is, I
No.
think, what we all say we want as
Yes,
parents
yes.
and as educators. We're not breeding that by feeding into this culture.
Not at all.
Okay. Yeah. So I would like to circle back to, because I know you have a lot of experience with neurodiverse kids.
Yes.
How do you think modern screen technology affects neurodiverse kids compared to neurotypical kids?
Yeah, so with any tool, I want to look at the pros and the cons. And so I'll
Mhm.
start with the positives. I try to be, sort of optimistic in the way I look at life. So the pros would be it's much easier to find community these
Yeah.
days for neurodivergent or, neurodiverse across the spectrum of neurodiversity, but specifically neurodivergent children. They can find information much more easily. They can find community. They can find resources, both the children and their parents. Um, on the opposite end is it's sort of the wild wild west as far as the internet, and so you can also find misinformation. You can also find maybe community spaces where folks are not talking about who you are and how you're different in a way that's affirming, in a way that's accurate, in a way that's compassionate. And then I think with things like the differences that we see with different forms of neurodivergence, whether it's impulsivity, whether it's maybe some naivete, um, the internet can be a breeding ground for a lot of pitfalls and road blocks as far as that goes. If you have some differences as it relates to impulsivity, well, what does that mean when you're participating on a message board or you're leaving that comment on an Instagram picture? That perhaps is going to get you in a lot of trouble where there's a disconnect between the intent of what you were hoping to convey versus the impact of what you actually shared with someone. And so, again, taking in those pros and cons, we need to leverage as much as possible those pros, take the good, and try to put up some guardrails and some parameters and some expectations to mitigate or potentially altogether avoid some of those pros. I mean, some of those cons, rather.
Yeah. The other thing too, and I know you know this, but we've had several experts speak to, let's take a really common one, such as like ADHD.
Yes.
So we really get into like the brain science, right? So,
Yes.
and maybe you can add to this, but from my understanding, kids with ADHD have reward seeking brains, right? So they're going to go after that novelty of whatever it is, the video game, the YouTube video, which is so much more alluring than that math homework, right? So those are the kids
Yeah.
that are going to have a harder time when you put an iPad in front of them to focus on a school assignment, right? Because their brain is immediately going to seek that reward. And then let's look at something that's a little bit more social, like autism, right? So from my
Hmm.
understanding there, those kids are the ones that kind of tend to benefit from things like distance learning, right? Where they aren't forced to go into social situations, but at the same time, they're not practicing those social situations, right? So those are just a couple examples. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but I just wanted to add at least the concept of the reward seeking brain, because that's really hard for teachers to understand, I think. And there are
Yeah.
issues inside the classroom that I've personally heard about and dealt with parents on this topic.
Yeah, I think understanding the neuroscience behind one, how some of these platforms are engineered and how that can lead to some addictive, properties with some of our kids is very important, particularly for our parents of ADHD, children, for our parents of autistic children. But then on the opposite end, to the point that you just made, yes, this sort of online universe can help you find your people in a way that perhaps you can't find in your school. So if you have a very, unique interest, maybe you're interested in, 1700s, dress, and you like to get dressed up that way and learn everything about that. There may not be anyone in your school that shares that interest, but online you may be able to find someone of the same age who you can engage with. And so I think that we need to look at practice as yes, that real world practice is imperative, but we also want to promote that sense of belonging, which every child needs. And some of our children's interests can be so unique that the technology, the internet can be one of the only places where they can feel at home and at peace. And then hopefully we push them in a way that's safe and obviously, supervised to then transfer those online relationships eventually to in-person opportunities to practice those skills.
Yeah, I mean, I love how you balanced that answer as well, because that is true. And you've mentioned this a couple times that that is one of the main pros of technologies like social media is offering community for those that normally wouldn't have it, right? So
Yes.
whether it's somebody that lives in a geographical area where maybe their community isn't accepted, right?
Yes.
Or what you're describing, which might be a neuro divergent kid that doesn't have a whole lot of people like them around them. Like those are the main pros that I hear over and over and over. It's just so tricky that the cost of that, right, is that we're feeding our kids into machine learning systems that are just so hard to navigate and so hard to limit. It's not a fair fight for them, or it's not,
Yeah.
they shouldn't have to, that shouldn't be the cost of finding community
Yep.
online, right?
No,
So
I
that, I think,
totally agree. I
yeah,
totally agree. And I think that highlights the importance of advocacy and one, making sure that we're going to our lawmakers, we're going to our public policy, the folks that put that forward and making sure that we hold these companies accountable. A Facebook, an Instagram, a TikTok, they need to be responsible for more than just how much money they make and how much money they give to their shareholders.
yeah,
If these platforms are open to children, then there should be a responsibility that it should be very easy to put guardrails up for parents, for educators, to make sure that they engage with these platforms to the extent that we feel comfortable with them engaging with them in a safe and affirming manner, and not just sort of open ended. Here, have at it. Everything is open to you unless your parent goes in and puts some things forward. And so, yeah, we have a long way to go to make sure that these things are safe for our kids.
yeah. Okay, so my next question's a loaded one. Should
Yeah,
schools offer mental health education and why?
without a question. I think mental health education is as important as the traditional, reading, writing, and arithmetic. You can't be in a space to learn and to put forth, your best effort academically if you aren't in a space of wellness, or at least awareness from a mental health standpoint. And so now more than ever, our kids need to be able to normalize all of the feelings that they may experience. They need to have a really robust toolbox of coping strategies that they can use when they experience these emotions. And they should also have confidence in their ability to access additional supports. Who do I go to in a school when I'm feeling dysregulated? Who do I go to in a school when I'm having thoughts of suicide? Who do I go to in a school when there's a problem that I'm having difficulty solving? And so, yes, I would put social emotional learning and mental health education as a pillar of education in the same way I would every other academic area that we traditionally focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I think earlier we covered this idea that everything's just so accelerated now, right?
Yes,
Everything's moving so fast and technology is driving that. It's also, and I'm the first one to say technology is not all to blame. It's just a
yeah,
piece of the puzzle, but it is accelerating youth mental health outcomes, right? So, like you talked about earlier, we just need to adapt to this, right? And we need
yes,
to have these resources available to these kids. I think the latest stat is 1 in 4 kids is struggling with depression, 1 in 5 is
mm,
anxiety. It might be flipped. So the numbers have just increased exponentially. So I'm glad that you agree that this is something that schools just need to offer now, where maybe before it was a little bit more of a luxury. I don't even know, but it's just like
yeah.
there's just such a higher demand for this, right? I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I mean, and I would go as far as to say that it would be educational malpractice. Schools would be remiss not to have some form of social emotional learning, some form of mental health education. There's just no way around that. And so, parents, educators, if you are in an educational space that lacks these services, please advocate for change. Parents, do the same. And let's start holding educational spaces accountable, but then also partnering with them to say,
Yeah.
hey, here's a program that I found. Hey, here's some challenges that our family is facing. Here's some resources. Let's work together to make sure that this community is moving in a direction toward wellness and mental health.
Yeah, and to your point, it only benefits academics, right? So
Yep,
these things are not separate things. Like these
not
things
at all.
are together. So it's worth the investment from multiple points of view, right?
And agree.
Okay, so my last question is phone-free schools. It's just a huge hot button topic right now. There's a lot of momentum right now on this issue. So, in the recent Common Sense Media report documenting youth smartphone use, kids age 11 to 17 received a median of 237 notifications a day, and about a quarter of those were during the school day. 97% of adolescents use their phones during school hours for an average of 43 minutes. And social media does take up the highest proportion of that time. So, given your experience with education, youth mental health, should smartphones be allowed on K through 12 campuses?
Yeah, so I'm in the camp of I don't believe that. So going back to this idea of pros and cons, there are certainly pros with smartphones and there are, ways that we can use them effectively. I think that there are a lot of cons and a lot of those cons sort of come into play or are contrary to sort of the instructional needs of the classroom.
Yeah.
And so with social media, with smartphones being a tool, a car is also a tool, but we as a society have made the decision that, okay, a 10-year-old doesn't need to drive a car because their brain is not to the point where they can handle that tool. And so I think the same way with smartphones, with social media, it is appropriate for us to look at the research, to look at what are our expectations for a school environment and how does this tool either help or detract from that, and say, this is not a tool that's going to be helpful for you here. Not that we're saying, no parents can buy phones or you can't use it after school, but during the school day, we're going to put these in our, yonder pouches or whatever it is we're using.
Yeah.
And this is not going to contribute to our objectives here. But we also will start giving you the education to use these tools responsibly when it is time to use them. So I think
Hmm.
that digital citizenship piece needs to be, it shouldn't just be phone free without the educational piece. They have to work hand in hand because we know that they're going to use it at some point. While I agree it shouldn't be during the school day, we want to make sure that they have the wherewithal, the knowledge, the skills to use it responsibly when they do.
Yeah. That's so true. Digital citizenship and digital wellness, super
Yep,
important because they need to understand kind of the mechanics of what's happening in their body as well, which I think
truly.
really, really helps. And I'll just throw in a couple points here because this is a big part of the work we're doing kind of at this very moment. For
Yes,
parents, so usually the administrators and the teachers are 100% on board. They see it firsthand, how distracting
yes,
it is, how it's affecting academics, how they're having to jump through hoops to compete, right? All that
yes,
stuff. And then as far as like discipline goes, they're bringing drama into schools. Like I can't tell you how many principals I've talked to that are like group texts are like at the
Oh,
top of the list.
yes. Oh, I see it every day.
Yeah, of things that they're dealing
Yes.
with. And again, to your point, schools aren't saying you can't do what you're going to do at home. But
Hmm.
this is not something that we should compete with, right? In order to effectively educate your kids. So I think that's like a really important distinction. And you made it, which is schools aren't telling parents what to do. They're just saying, when your students are in our on our campuses where our job is to educate them,
Yes.
like this is something that is making it very, very difficult for us to do our
Yep.
job. So I think that was a really, really good distinction that you made there. And in terms of parent pushback, as far as the statistics I've seen, most parents actually very much worry about the
Hmm.
mental health and safety and everything else that has to do with smartphones.
Yes.
And from the polls I've seen, most of them actually do want them out of schools. It's a small, loud group that push back,
The
and the
vocal
reason,
minority.
yeah, exactly, and their reasons are safety. So
Yeah.
sadly, they're thinking about school shootings. Like, let's just call out the elephant in the room. But once you start to educate them, first of all, on the odds of that, which is 1 in 5 million, there was a professor at Northwestern University that calculated that versus
Yes.
1 in 4 and 1 in 5 for depression and anxiety. You educate them on the academics portion, you educate them on the drama portion. It
Yes.
really makes a big difference because, to your point about educating the students, we also need to educate the parents so
Oh,
that they
yes.
understand the reasons for this, right? And then the
Definitely.
one that I cannot wrap my mind around is the convenience. I need to text my kid during the day, right? So, in what world, when hey, when you get a text in your deep state of focus, it takes 23 minutes to get back into that deep state of focus. Like, in what world
Yes.
is that okay for parents to think that they should be texting their kids during class? So, that was a lot for me. I want your input, but those are the things that we're talking about right now.
Well, I think the concern, over the lack of maybe instant access or, 24/7 access goes to that surveillance parenting piece that you
Yeah.
were speaking of. And I think it can be quite anxiety inducing for our parents who are accustomed to having this direct connection to their child to sort of let go. And so we need to be aware of these concerns and front load information about, safety is a legitimate concern. But the question is, okay, we now have a dedicated line for parents to call in if there are emergencies, and we
Yeah.
will make sure that that message is conveyed to you. So it's best to get in front of these possible concerns, be proactive about the way we discuss any changes in policy, so that we can speak to the issues that are out there, and really engage with our community in a way that makes them know that, okay, they're listening to the things that we're worried about. And we're working together to make sure that this school experience is one that's much more productive for our children.
Yeah. And I'm not surprised that you know this because you're coming from the mental health aspect. But one of the things we really recommend is empathizing with the parents, right? But then
Yes,
also making sure they know there's a system in place, right? Which you
yes,
just
yes.
said. And then there should be really no reason for them to feel like they need to take control of any emergency situation, which is
Hmm.
counterproductive anyway. Emergency
Agreed.
management specialists will all tell you in a true emergency, kids texting their parents is not going to work. First of all, it's
No.
loud, it's
Yes,
distracting, it
yes,
creates
yes.
chaos. Like it's just if you think about the practicality of that, like it just doesn't make sense. So, so thanks for raising that, and it sounds like you guys are on top of it. So, that's great.
We're trying. I mean, every school is a work in progress, and so we want to be better tomorrow than we were today, and better than we were yesterday. And so we want to engage with our families, engage with all stakeholders to analyze what we're doing, to reflect and make adjustments when we need to, and the things that are working, continue those and improve those.
Yeah. Well, Justin, thank you so much for your time. Your insight from coming inside of a school and from your mental health expertise is just invaluable. I think it's going to be really, really useful for parents and educators and everybody else that we speak to kind of understand the benefits too of having a school psychologist on board. It's just invaluable from our point of view in the work we do. So thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to folks who are passionate about things like mental health and just holistic wellness. So it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Justin.